My name is Alison Marshall. I'm a professor at Breton University in the religion department, pronouns she, her. And I'm here to talk about my new co-edited book, the Bloomsbury Handbook of Religious Ecstasy. It's a project I've wanted to do for a very long time for many reasons. Mostly because I started it, this was my PhD topic and it was something I worked on, and then I didn't feel like the time was right to publish it at the time. So I went on and I worked in history. I published 3 monographs in history, won some awards, really loved that work. And then when I'd finished doing my historical work, I came back to the topic that I had started in 2000. Years ago, I worked on the topic of religious ecstasy for my dissertation. So the dissertation was about the theater of ecstasy, how spirit mediumship and dance was used in contemporary Taiwanese theater, and also how it was an important part of daily life in Taiwan. And so I did field work for years in Taiwan, and then I wrote my dissertation looking at classical texts and modern sort of ethnographic work that I'd collected. So that was in 2000, and then I came back to this years later. Why? What was the inspiration? I think the inspiration was times have changed. We're living in a time when, on the one hand, religion is disappearing, right? Religion has been rejected. It's associated with colonialism. It's associated with discrimination. And so people are leaving mainstream churches. They're leaving institutional contexts, and they're starting to do religion their own way. You know, any of these projects, it takes many years just to think about them, right? And to conceive of them. And so I had this in the back of my mind, but I was noticing that people weren't stopping being religious. I know you hear about religious nuns. Those are not the N-U-Ns, but the nuns, the N-O-N-E-S. And those are the people who still crave meaning in their life, right? In a way, this is one thing that sets us apart from AI, right? We're looking for meaning. We're looking for that aha moment in our daily lives. And that's something I've thought about since I was a child, that moment, that spark. And so as I thought about this changing terrain of religiosity and what it meant to be religious, I kept coming back to religious ecstasy, right? This core experience. And many of us many of us in the field of religion started with the definition that is very Christian, from the Greek word meaning to stand outside oneself, ecstasis. But religious ecstasy is more than that. And so as I started to think about this new project, I needed people to work with me on it because I didn't really want to do a monograph for this one. I wanted to sort of go out and see who was working on what, and I also wanted it to be collaborative. So I worked with my longtime friend, Rubina Ramji from Breton University, and we had worked on the Handbook of Religion and Migration together. And so after we finished that, I thought, oh, that was so much fun. I'd love to do another project with a friend. So Ruby and I started talking, and I was a little worried because religious ecstasy is not a popular topic. It's becoming more popular now, but at a time when Christianity is linked with colonialism and some bad things that have happened, residential schools and those kinds of things, it still has a bit of a bad reputation. But as we talked about it, we started to frame the discussion in a way that decentered Christianity, which is what we did with the other handbook on religion and migration. And we really wanted this to be about religions that are often seen to be on the margins, or practices that are often seen to be on the margins, and don't have a lot of power or prestige today. But these are also religions to which people are drawn, right? And practices that people are drawn to. So as we discussed that, we wanted Sufism, right? We wanted some aspect of Judaism like Kabbalah. We wanted spirit mediumship. We wanted something from Africa because that's an up and coming area of study, little studied religious practices. So those were kind of the starting conversations. And then we realized we need someone who does theory. So we went to our friend Michael Wilkinson and asked him if he would be part of this. So the three of us started having conversations about what we wanted to do. And then we talked to Bloomsbury, who was interested. We'd worked with them before and took it from there. So we put out a call for papers, and we were looking for a broad range of perspectives, regions. Again, we didn't want this to be focused necessarily on Christianity or the US. We wanted it to be global in its perspective. So we put out a call for papers, and then we looked, and we wanted a range of younger scholars and more established scholars and exciting papers. And I think what we put together is terrific, right? It's got something on neo-shamanism, so the emergence of shamanism, but new forms of shamanism, and how in the modern Western world, people are looking toward old traditions and remaking them. And so this particular scholar, Leron Schultz, looks at Emil Durkheim's idea of collective effervescence. And what he talks about is this new form in modern worlds where we're more urbanized, we're not living in rural areas. He talks about distributive effervescence. So essentially, if we're talking about religious ecstasy, we're talking about moments of religious ecstasy that are a little more subtle. And modern Western people who are living in urban centers and craving religion, who have left their churches, are kind of rediscovering that and rediscovering themselves and maybe calling themselves shamans. A term that is loaded, right? A term that refers to a circumpolar practice that originated in Siberia. So in the past, people have associated that with New Age practices and maybe appropriation. It can be very negative, but the way in which Schultz reframes it shows us that it's kind of a human tendency, right, to take practices that seem really valuable and incorporate them in your life. And so he explains it in a way that's sociological and develops Emil Durkheim's idea of collective effervescence, so that you have this distributed effervescence. And so some people may not know what effervescence is. It's like almost like a bubbling over, an electric current. If you touch an electric current, it kind of vibrates. And you see that in a lot of narratives. If you collect stories from people who have experienced religious ecstasy, they talk about maybe vibrations or feeling signals or this heat. Michael Wilkinson works on a Pentecostal group, and they talk about catching fire. So that's the effervescence, right? That it's this religious heat that sort of bubbles over, and everyone can catch this fire. So collective effervescence or distributive effervescence is contagious. And so that's another aspect of religious ecstasy, is it can make individuals feel wonderful, but it also has this wonderful healing property. So that's another aspect of the book. We looked for chapters and authors who were working on healing. And so we have a wonderful chapter on African rituals, African healing rituals that involve ecstasy from an Afrocentric perspective, using African theory, African methods. So that was another important thing to our approach to collecting the different chapters. In the book, we define religious ecstasy not relying on that idea of ecstasis that is so often the way people start with the subject in Christianity, but rather we look to theorists, and we look to see what theorists have said about this, what seems to be a very common human experience. People say it's an extraordinary experience, but our starting point is it's very ordinary. It's something that makes us human. And so we look to Max Weber, a sociologist, and he talked about ecstasy as charisma, right? This gift from God. And that is that's the perspective of some people. So a section of the book is organized that way, with chapters that look at ecstasy as charisma, this gift from God, where people get a special knowledge or a power. And that's another thread going through the book, which is that ecstasy gives you power. And because it gives you power, it's something that is contested. People fight to control ecstasy, right? Because it gives you this wisdom, it gives you this power, it heals people, it energizes people, it builds community. We also looked at collective effervescence. And we have a section in the book on spirit possession. So ecstasy as spirit possession, and I have my chapter based on a lot of my work, my early research, my early funded research by the Jiang Jinghua Foundation in Taiwan, who've been very generous to me. That's the CCK Foundation. Funded my research on spirit mediumship. And then I continued that through the years with a number of SSHRC grants. I was very fortunate to be funded through that. And I did field work on spirit mediumship in China and Taiwan, a lot of places. I was fascinated with it. And my research was driven by ethnography. So collecting the voices, the experiences, the reflections of people who'd actually had these life-changing, transformative, ecstatic experiences. So one section of the book is about ecstasy as spirit possession, drawing on collective effervescence, this experience of not always the same, but often people who experience spirit possession feel like they are, like there's this vibration, right, that courses through their body, but it's not always the same. But other people that we talk about in the book and in that section talk about spirit possession as control and dominance and an abuse of power. So Paul Stoller, we look at him. So that's a wonderful window into another aspect, which is a very powerful theme in the book, which is that ecstasy is wonderful, but it can also be used to control people, and you become vulnerable in it. So that's a bit of a concern. The third section in our book is ecstasy as intoxication. So that's where my chapter comes in. I have been fascinated in the subject of drug-induced spirituality since I came to graduate school. It was something that I sort of grew up around, but I was fascinated and inspired by Richard Alpert, and so this chapter was personal to me. Max Weber also talks about ecstasy as almost being drunk, right? With this love of God, this intense feeling of becoming one with something else. We really wanted that in the handbook as well. So we have an entire section on that. And that includes chapters that look at ecstasy as intoxication. So my chapter, we have one on the music and the Nagun in Judaism. And then we have one on Sufism by Rubina Ramji. So we look at ecstasy as this just all-encompassing, transformative, altered state that in some ways is like being drunk with a love of God or a love of the universe, the dissolving of boundaries, a feeling of connection. And so that's how we organized the book primarily. And then at the end of the book, because we had all of these new approaches to religious ecstasy, we had a section on modern manifestations. And there we put Burning Man, which can sometimes include drug-induced spirituality. We have something on a Japanese new religious movement that involves touching and the moving of spirit and energy that comes through ecstatic religious experience, and a number of other interesting chapters. Right now, studies on religion dying or growing secularism, churches disappearing, that's it's very prominent in the media. So I think it challenges modern perceptions of religion by refocusing our attention on something that is very ordinary, that people throughout the world look to for meaning in their daily lives. So it's not extraordinary, it's not something unusual for many people, but in the modern Western world, we seem to be kind of driven toward this secular perspective. So the other way we can think about religious ecstasy as challenging current understandings of religion is the way in which religious ecstasy has often been portrayed as either miraculous or madness. So if you look at narratives, colonial narratives, missionary narratives of people, indigenous people especially, who are having religious experiences that are not Christian, they have traditionally been portrayed, these individuals, as mad. But the reverse of this is the dualism, right? The dual perspective that speaking in tongues, right? These very missionaries who were chastising indigenous peoples for losing their minds and being mad, were having their own religious experiences, and these were seen to be miraculous. So there is, when we look at religious ecstasy, there's kind of this, there's always a tension. Dualistic, right? It's miracle, it's madness. It's this power struggle to control it. It's this power struggle because religious ecstasy is ultimately about finding some intuitive knowledge, finding something out about yourself, finding out something about the world you live in. And that's challenging. And for a long time, people have denied the validity of studies about religious ecstasy. So many of us didn't want to publish in that area because it was seen to be flaky. It was seen to be unscientific. It was seen to be unbecoming of academia. And there are lots of people who have written about that. But I think in our societies, we become more reflective as we're starting to be more open to Indigenous ways of seeing and understanding and knowing. As we crave connections, we're starting to see more and more people crave that experience for themselves, right? Energize themselves, find some meaning in their life. And so I think that is part of the appeal of the book. And I think going forward, someone mentioned this at the recent meetings, the Congress meetings of the Canadian Society for the Study of Religion. And they mentioned this as maybe something that needs to be explored is many of us who write about religious ecstasy have in fact experienced religious ecstasy. Now we're writing about it as sociologists or anthropologists or historians, but is there room perhaps for a more reflexive approach to this study that isn't necessarily theological, that isn't necessarily looking to reduce religious ecstasy as the core of all religions, but rather offers a new vantage point? So that's something interesting that we might start to see more and more people who reflect on maybe their visions of entities while they're, having these drug-induced spiritual experiences, and are taken seriously for their discussion of their own interior experience as psychonauts. I don't know. That's just an example of where this might go in the future. This project didn't necessarily come out of one research grant. It came out of a lifetime of research. My other research is very much geared toward historical Chinese religious political organizations. But this particular study, I would say I've been working on for 25 years. And so the Jiang Jingguo Foundation funded me. And as a graduate student, I was funded by SSHRC. And in 2012, I had SSHRC funding to look at religious experience in the Chinese-Canadian context. And so in these little sort of pockets of funding that I've gotten, and some of them quite sizable, I worked very hard and I'm very proud to have been successful in these various competitions. But throughout the years, SSHRC and I would say the CCK and of course Breton University has given me this wonderful life of research and time to reflect and support with my teaching and my research. And I'm really grateful to have done all that I've done, culminating in this 5th co-edited book, in addition to my 3 monographs. I'd like to thank my co-editors. I'd like to thank Rubina Ramji for being willing to co-edit another book. I'd like to thank Michael Wilkinson for helping us with theory and writing his chapters. I'd like to thank Lal Persglove from Bloomsbury Press, who has been so supportive of the last 2 projects. It's been wonderful working with an editor like her. I'd like to thank the Dean and President of Breton University, Vice President Academic, Chair of my department, and colleagues, and my husband and my family who have, shared in this journey with me. And of course, all of the contributors. Last but not least, this book would not be written without all of the contributors. I think I'd like people to take the subject of religious ecstasy, religious experience more seriously. I think we'll see more studies that show that being not necessarily religious doesn't mean that you don't have religious experience, that people will go on to talk about how people are religious in front of home altars, how people are religious on their walks. I think we'll see studies about climate action and religion, and how people are becoming more in tune with our environment. I think we'll see more studies of Indigenous spirituality and ecstasy. There's so much that can be done now that we've started to be a little more open to the subject of religious ecstasy.